This legend has been passed down through generations in my family. The story dates back to the youth and adolescence of my grandfather, so it takes place in the 1940s. The small village where I grew up is located far from any other populated area. The nearest town is a bit bigger, called João de Barro, and it's several kilometers away, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that crosses a dense forest. When I was a child, the path had already been widened enough for cars to pass, though it was always tricky when two vehicles met coming from opposite directions. Only in certain spots could the vegetation allow one car to pull aside, so both could go through. Not long after, cobblestones were laid down on that road, transforming it into a proper street which remains the same to this day. Back then, my family would travel that road every Saturday without fail. My parents would go to the other town to buy groceries, and my cousins, who were around my age, would come with us to get supplies for their families too. Instead of sitting in the front with my parents, I preferred riding in the back of the truck, chatting and playing with them. Sometimes people from our street would join us. All of my older cousins, even some outsiders, knew the story of my grandfather and the road, a tale that was passed down to me and one I'll now share with you. My grandfather met a young woman whom he fell deeply in love with. She lived in the bigger village, and he would always find excuses to visit her. However, after meeting her, he got to know her older sister, who began paying him a lot of attention when he visited his girlfriend. Her mother then suggested that he should pursue the older sister instead, claiming that the younger one would never marry and would stay home to take care of her mother. My grandfather grew concerned because the visits to his girlfriend became less frequent, as her mother would not even allow her to go to the grocery store for fear of running into him. Eventually, my grandfather spoke to his parents. By then, he was 16 and felt ready to start a family. His girlfriend was almost 14, but he worried about her safety. He begged his parents to let him take her away, promising that he would bring her back home and build their house the very next day. His parents refused, stating that they needed permission from the girl's family. One day, the older sister came to my grandfather's village to meet his parents. She found them working on their small property and introduced herself as his girlfriend. His parents were taken aback since she was tall and imposing, nothing like the delicate image my grandfather had painted. She practically forced them to invite her to lunch. That's when they realized that she wasn't the girlfriend, but the feared older sister. She told them what would be required for the marriage, adding that she didn't want to live in their village and would find a place to live with him. She also mentioned that the younger sister insisted she was the true love, but she would soon find a way to stop her from interfering. Those who talk too much always pay the price, she said. She stayed until late, leaving only at 11 p.m., by which time my grandfather still hadn't arrived. His parents were so frightened by her presence that they eventually agreed to let him abduct the girl, fearing that the girl's family might harm him. To them, this seemed like the only logical course of action. My grandfather arranged everything with a friend of his girlfriend, who visited and warned her about the plan. Over the following days, he secretly met with her several times, and each time he would take a few of her belongings without her family noticing. The older sister was terrifying, but even more so was the mother, a fearsome woman. The following day, my grandfather walked to the village to double-check the plan. He walked around the area several times, inspecting the window through which the girl was supposed to escape that night. Suddenly, the window opened. It was her. "I thought I heard you," she said, surprising him by speaking to him. "My mother and sister are not home. They went to look for you. I don't know if they know about your plan, but they've gone after you." My grandfather kissed her and promised to return that night as planned. It was their first kiss. He walked back, feeling so happy that he forgot the fear of the dark. He said he didn't even remember the old tales about werewolves and other creatures that the elders used to tell to prevent young people from traveling between villages at night. The moonlight illuminated the path just enough for him to see, but he proceeded with caution. As he walked, he noticed something strange, a large snake on the path. He stepped aside to avoid it, but when he tried to return to the path, he couldn't find it. It was as if he had wandered deeper into the forest. It was only a few meters, but it felt disorienting. Luckily, he had learned how to navigate using the stars, and after a while he found his way back and quickened his pace. However, he felt like someone was following him. Soon he saw another massive tree, even larger than the last one. When he looked back down at the trail, something enormous was blocking his way. A wild boar, at least a meter tall. It was an impressive sight, and it terrified him. He watched as the beast struggled to stand on two legs, and without thinking, he ran back into the woods, afraid of being caught. It took him half an hour to find the path again, But before returning to the trail, he scanned the area carefully. He then made his way through the underbrush, moving cautiously to avoid detection. As he walked, he saw two figures ahead standing in the middle of the path. He recognized them. They were the mother and sister of his bride, dressed in white and waiting for him to pass. He moved slowly, trying not to make a sound. Once he was about 100 meters away from them, he started running. As he returned to the path, he heard the galloping of a horse approaching quickly behind him. A neighbor from the village found him and, seeing his fear, urged him to climb onto the horse. My grandfather told the man everything that had happened. The man was surprised by what he heard, and as they rode back to the village, they quickly approached the entrance. But when they reached it, the man stopped. "Were those the women following you?" he asked. My grandfather described them, and the man questioned, "But if they were behind us, why are they waiting at the entrance?" My grandfather peeked over the man's shoulder and saw the two women standing with their arms outstretched, blocking the entrance. The man drew a revolver and fired a shot into the air. The women didn't move, but the shot wasn't meant to scare them. It was a signal. Soon the sound of men gathering echoed through the village. The men were preparing to protect their own. When the women saw the approaching crowd, they ran off into the woods like animals. My grandfather ran home, and the neighbor, along with other men, tried to chase them on horseback but couldn't catch up. The plan had to be postponed. My grandfather warned his friends and the girl's friend that they would have to wait until she was of legal age to marry her. But that wasn't what happened. One day he abducted the young woman, and he never returned to the village. They disappeared, leaving the area. Years later, her mother passed away, and the sister left, never to return. It wasn't until then that my grandfather returned with his wife, my grandmother. They built a life together in the village, but she never spoke of her family. She never confirmed these stories, at least not to the grandchildren. However, whenever we went to the neighboring village to buy supplies, she would point out those 3 large trees that are still standing today. The story I'm about to tell happened to me and my family about 13 years ago, or more specifically, in the first few months after my younger sister was born. At the time, my older sister was attending high school in the afternoon. I was in the 5th grade of elementary school and my twin brothers were still in preschool. Since we had different school schedules, it allowed us to take turns looking after my baby sister and my mom, who was still recovering from the birth. My father worked in the construction industry, mostly in masonry. Due to the lack of job opportunities and low wages in the city and surrounding areas, he had to find work in other states. This became even more urgent when my mother became pregnant. Back then, my father was working in Pernambuco, which meant he couldn't be present at the birth of my sister due to financial reasons. He only got to meet her later on when he returned. One day, while we were in the living room, my mom asked us to go up to the rooftop to see if my older sister was on her way home. It was then that I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. It was a distinct noise because the door was made of wood with a metal plate, and it always scraped when moved. I immediately thought it was my father returning. Excited, I rushed to the entrance, eager to be the first to greet him, help him with his things, and share in the joy of his return. My siblings and I always had this playful competition when it came to welcoming him home. In the midst of the excitement, we forgot something very important. Our newborn sister was left all alone in the room. We only realized this when it was already too late. On the way to the rooftop, I noticed a dark shadow in the yard. Although the place wasn't very well lit, this shape stood out against the darkness. A deep fear took over me, and without thinking, I ran back to the bedroom, overwhelmed by panic. When I arrived, my mother was rushing inside too, as if she sensed something was wrong. Everything happened so fast. I remember seeing a shadow crouched at the foot of the bed where my sister was sleeping. It looked as if it was watching her intently. The figure turned to face us as we entered, and my mother screamed, scolding whatever it was that had dared to be there. Like most Christian families, we practiced Christianity in our home. We followed the traditional view that baptism should only happen when a person is aware and ready to choose it, unlike other religions that perform baptisms on infants. Despite this, my mother's shout made it clear that the figure was trying to lure us out of the room. However, it had failed because, as my mother said, "Who is with us is far more powerful than what's in this room." In an instant, I felt a strong gust of wind coming from the room, and my mother and I rushed outside, running into the nearby fields. We could hear something moving between the corn stalks, and when we looked closely, we saw a figure climbing a mango tree. It's hard to describe it, but it looked human at first glance. However, as it ascended, its shape twisted and morphed into a reptilian form about the size of a small child. Once it reached the top of the tree, it stood still, watching us from between the branches. At that moment, my brothers were coming down from the roof. They said they had heard a voice humming a song, which seemed to hypnotize them, until my mother's screams broke their trance. That night, we couldn't sleep on the roof. We heard footsteps, and now and then a strange sound, almost like a turkey, but with a much deeper tone. This wasn't the first nor the last time we experienced such a chase. On other occasions, when we went up to wait for my older sister, we would see a ball of fire appearing and disappearing between the trees near the house. Today, my sister is 13 years old, rebellious like many girls her age. But something worth mentioning is that since she was little, she has been followed by these entities. She's had encounters with a woman who appears in the house when she's alone, among other experiences. If you allow me, I can share more about these encounters at another time. I never imagined I would be one of those people who ends up leaving a comment on one of these videos, sharing my story, but here I am. This happened in February of the year before last, and after everything I experienced, I realized how common it is for nannies to go through strange and unsettling experiences. I started working as a nanny for Alessandra because her parents were acquaintances of a family I had worked with for several years. This family had moved away and no longer needed my services, but before they left, they recommended me through their social networks. That's how I ended up at Alessandra's house, without a doubt, the most beautiful home I had ever worked in. In fact, it was the most stunning house I had ever stepped into until then. On the day I arrived, the woman responsible for the house, Liza, let me in. She was waiting for me and the family was about to arrive. As I sat down, I heard a few notes of a beautiful melody coming from the piano. The woman who had let me in came back into the room and gave me a nervous smile, and I noticed she was playing the piano. It seemed like she wasn't supposed to be doing that, but I didn't say anything. She quickly left, leaving me alone. I decided to take a walk around the first floor for a bit. The piano was beautifully placed in the center of the main room, and even though I don't know much about musical instruments, I could tell it was something special. When the family arrived, I went back to the sofa where they had asked me to wait. Everyone came in, and the first thing the mother did was lock the piano room door. It was clearly something important, which might explain why the woman from the cleaning crew seemed so nervous. I started working that weekend, and the family went on a short trip. After that, only Alessandra would return to the house. I would take care of her on Saturday and Sunday. It struck me as odd, but the pay was great, and the girl was very quiet but extremely polite. Throughout that Saturday, she didn't cause me any trouble. She finished her tasks in the morning and spent the rest of the afternoon reading. I found it strange to see a child reading books that were much too advanced for her age. At 8 p.m., before I could say anything, she was already in her room preparing for bed. I asked if she needed anything, and she said she just wanted some water but could go downstairs to get it. I told her it wasn't necessary, and she thanked me, then put on her headphones connected to an old iPod. That too caught my attention. I went downstairs to get the water, and while I was filling the glass, lost in thought about what it would be like to grow up in a house like that, never worrying about financial issues, I heard a few piano notes coming from the room. I was surprised and thought that maybe Alessandra had gone downstairs without permission. I was about to say something when I realized the door was locked and the lights were off. I must have heard wrong, I thought, and went back upstairs to check on her. When I entered her room, there she was, and when I approached her with the water, she took off her headphones and thanked me. I noticed the volume was very high, so I warned her that it could damage her ears. "It helps me sleep," she replied without saying anything else while putting the headphones back on. I thought it was strange, but with all the detailed instructions her parents had given me, there was nothing mentioned about not allowing headphones. Besides, it was our first day together, so I let it go. I went to the next room trying to sleep early too, but again, I heard some piano notes that caught my attention. I put my phone on silent and didn't hear anything more. Later, those same notes came back. I left the room and moved closer to the stairs to listen better, but when I got there was no sound. I was scared to go down and check, so I returned to my room, determined to sleep. After reading for a bit, my eyes started to close and suddenly I jumped out of my bed in shock. The piano notes were played loudly, waking me up immediately from my nap. I got up, unsure of what to do, and the only thing I could think of was to go to Alessandra's room and check if she was still there. I opened the door, and there she was, wide-eyed, staring at me. She pointed to a drawer. I approached it and opened it. Inside there were several things, including a pair of large headphones. I took the headphones and looked at Alessandra, who didn't say a word and went back to lying down, ignoring me. I closed the drawer, left the room, and went back to the other room. I lay down and put in my own headphones, hoping to fall asleep. I clearly remember that, in that half-sleep state, every time a song finished and there was a few seconds of silence, I could hear the piano melody echoing through the house. Eventually, my name is Mariana, and what I'm about to share happened in 2017 in a small village where my younger sister Maria lived. Maria was a joyful and hard-working young woman. Although she wasn't married, she always seemed to have a special kind of luck in her relationships. Her boyfriends were handsome, kind-hearted, and well-off, which often sparked admiration from some, and unfortunately envy from others. Among those who couldn't tolerate Maria's luck was Graciela, a childhood friend. Graciela had a strong personality and had always been close to our family. However, as the years passed, her friendship with Maria became increasingly strained. Despite her efforts to hide it, it became evident that Graciela resented how easily Maria could form relationships and find partners who admired her. This jealousy began to show through passive-aggressive comments and behaviors that slowly wore down their bond. If you're a woman, you probably know exactly what kind of comments I'm talking about. It all started one morning when Maria found a strange pile of ashes at the entrance of her house. The ashes were arranged in a circle, and in the center there was a bundle of needles stuck into a small piece of fabric. At first, she thought it was just a tasteless prank by some boy from the neighborhood. She swept the ashes away and carried on with her day, but an unsettling feeling lingered throughout the afternoon. In the following days, strange things began to happen. Her meetings with her new boyfriend, Arthur, were unexpectedly cancelled. His motorcycle was involved in 2 mysterious accidents, and the flowers he had given Maria withered almost immediately. Arthur, who had always been affectionate, started pulling away without any clear reason. One night, while talking to me on the phone, Maria mentioned that she had seen Graciela near her house. However, Graciela didn't approach or speak to her. She simply stood in front of the door, staring inside. I tried to calm her down, but her voice showed that she was afraid. The next day, Maria found another strange object at the entrance, a small wax figure with needles stabbed into its torso, accompanied by a note that said, "This is just the beginning." It was clear that someone was trying to harm her, and her first suspicion fell on Graciela. However, without solid proof, Maria decided not to confront her directly. Worried, my sister called me to tell me everything that was happening. I lived in the city, but decided to travel to the village to support her. When I arrived, I noticed the tension in the house. Her once welcoming home now felt dark and empty. Maria seemed down and more tired than usual. That same night, while we were having dinner, we heard a loud noise coming from the kitchen. When we checked, we found that one of the windows was broken, and there was a pile of dirt and dry leaves on the floor. We couldn't understand how this had happened. We cleaned everything up and tried to move on, but we both knew something was wrong. A neighbor advised us to seek out Donna Elena, a local woman known for her spiritual wisdom. We told her everything that had been happening, and after listening carefully, Donna Elena said, "This is no coincidence. Someone is jealous of you and is using energy to harm you." She asked us to bring any strange objects we found and advised us not to confront Graciela directly. Donna Elena also performed a cleansing in Maria's house and gave us a vial. I've never been sure if I should call that day the strangest or the most disturbing of my life. Maybe it was both. I was 14 years old, living in a small town in the southeastern part of South Dakota, not far from a big river called the Big Sioux. The summers there were two things: humid and endless. We had gravel roads stretching over miles of asphalt, bordered on one side by farmland, and small clusters of trees on the other. At that time, my primary mode of transportation was an old, battered bicycle, an inheritance from my older brother who had traded it for a car. The bike had more rust than paint, but the wheels and the chain still worked, and that was all that mattered. My mom didn't worry too much about me riding around on my own. Everyone in our small town knew each other, and people would usually wave when you passed by their house. It was a peaceful place, or so it seemed. It was the end of July, and the day started hot and muggy with storm clouds forming in the west. I was eager to get out of the house after finishing my chores, so I grabbed my bike and set off down a rural road that cut through cornfields. My plan was to meet up with a friend who lived about 8 kilometers away, near the edge of town, where the fields gave way to a gentle hill dotted with pines and cottonwoods. We had planned to ride out to an old, abandoned property where, according to rumors, there was a rundown barn we could explore. It was the kind of thing kids do during the slow summer days. About halfway there, I noticed the clouds overhead had turned a strange greenish hue, and the wind had changed. There was that eerie silence that often comes before a storm. I looked to the horizon and realized a storm was definitely approaching, and it was coming faster than I'd anticipated. I figured I had enough time to get to my friend's house before the rain started, so I pedaled harder. The stretch of road I was on passed through fields, but also skirted the edge of a narrow line of trees, almost like a windbreak that a local farmer had planted decades ago. Just as I got closer to that line of trees, the air turned colder. It was as though I had entered a shadow, even though the sun was still above the horizon. I remember smelling the damp earth, as if it had already rained somewhere ahead. My gaze swept over the trees, mostly pines with some taller cottonwoods, their leaves trembling in the wind. I couldn't see far beyond the first trunks, but I always had the feeling that the woods were deeper than they appeared. It seemed like a thin boundary from the outside, but perhaps denser once you were inside. That's when I heard a noise just beyond the ditch, near where a barbed wire fence separated the road from the trees. It wasn't a normal sound like a horse or a cow stepping on dry leaves. It was heavier, almost like something was keeping pace with me, moving at the same rhythm. My foot hesitated on the pedal, and I slowed down, scanning the low brush. A gust of wind shook the leaves, and for a moment I thought maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks. But then a dark shape moved. At first I told myself it had to be an animal, perhaps a coyote standing on its hind legs or a lost dog, but the shape wasn't quite right for that. Honestly, I couldn't make out a clear outline, just a large, dark, fast-moving form, and yet it didn't flee like a startled coyote or dog would. It was just watching. For a moment I froze. My hands gripped the handlebars so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a person. There were hunters in the area, even though it wasn't hunting, and those were today's stories. Did you like any of them? Comment on which one you liked and tell us if you've ever experienced something like this in your life. Don't forget to like, and I hope to see you in the next video, if you have the courage to watch more stories.